Yo, what's going on, guys? I wanted to take a video and try to tackle a very common thing that I hear discussed in Dead by Daylight, which is the gen speeds. Well, gen speeds is going to be the main topic, but we're going to be discussing gen speeds as well as your expectations for a match, as well as the pacing of general games. It's going to be a mix of quite a few topics. So we can start out by just answering the question, are gen speeds actually a problem? Do they go too fast? Well, spoiler alert, I think the answer is no. Now, before you dislike the video and go down to the comments and call me a survivor man and swear off anything I ever do or any opinion I ever have in the future, take a second to listen to my argument and then you can do all that. So something I've noticed is that I think most of the time that people complain about generator speeds, it usually comes from a bad perspective on the game. They don't really understand the pacing of the game and they don't really have a good expectation of how games usually go. So allow me to give you a brief explanation. When a match of Dead by Daylight first starts out, the killer spawns and the 4 survivors are spawned throughout the match and the killer is very far away from them. At this point in time in the match, the killer has 0 pressure. Now, by pressure, we're going to be talking about how much the survivors have to stay off generators. That is generally what pressure is. The more pressure that is applied on the survivors, the less time that they can be on generators and the more times they have to be doing other things. If there's no pressure, then they all can be working on generators. Pressure in this scenario is going to be strictly objectives and keeping them off of objectives. So at the very start of a game, you have no pressure. If all 4 survivors spawn right on top of a generator, they could all immediately start doing the objective and you have nothing to stop them from doing it. They have no reason to do anything else other than objectives. You don't even begin to apply pressure on the survivors until you at least find the first survivors and start to chase them. This is where you start, and this applies pressure to 1 survivor. So when you get into a chase with a survivor, the survivor that you're chasing is now pressured. They can't be doing a generator because if they do, you'll kill them. But the other 3 survivors, however, they have no pressure. There's no reason for them to do anything other than the generators. Now, this mixed with the fact that at the beginning of a game, all the pallets are still alive and the map still has every resource available, means that this is a very powerful time for survivors. This is a very, very strong time for the survivor team, and this is a very weak spot on the killer side. Now, as the match goes on, assuming you're playing killer well, you'll be applying pressure a lot. You'll be downing survivors, which applies pressure because it means that the survivor is downed, can't do gens because obviously they're either downed or hooked, and another survivor has to come off their generator to either pick them up off the ground or save them from the hook, which applies pressure to another survivor. And also, you don't have to actively chase the guy anymore, which opens you up to chase a third, which that applies pressure to 3 people, being the guy hooked, the guy going for the rescue, and the third guy who is now being chased. This can go even further if you can get snowballed pressure, which is something I talk about in a lot of my videos, and it's something I talk about with killer in general, where if you can snowball pressure and get, maybe multiple downs at the same time, maybe multiple hooks, or like a hook and a down at the same time, this applies pressure to the whole team. In the previous scenario, there was a 4th survivor who still had no pressure on him, who is free to work on gens the whole time that you're downing survivors, hooking them while they're getting unhooked. There's still a 4th guy who's able to do gens the entire time. If you can snowball pressure by downing multiple survivors quickly, then it applies pressure to all 4 survivors because you can have multiple survivors completely unable to move or do generators or do anything, and you can be chasing the third, meaning the 4th has to go for the saves. This is generally what you should aspire to do in every killer game, and this is something that isn't possible until around the mid-game. If you can get to this point as killer, it does not matter how many generators are done. They could literally have finished 4 out of the 5 generators, and if you can get to this point, you can close out a match completely without any more objectives getting done. So basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that in a general game of Dead by Daylight, in the beginning, the survivors are essentially all powerful, and the killer is at his very, very weakest point. As the match goes on, however, that starts to flip-flop. As the survivors start to lose resources, they start to use up pallets. As the killer starts to get downs and starts applying pressure and can maybe even build on that pressure and snowball it into even more pressure, then the game starts to flip-flop and become a lot more in the killer's favor. This is obviously assuming that the killer player is playing well and not going on like a 2 or 3 minute chase. Now, if you're somebody that understands this, if you know that this is the general pacing of a Dead by Daylight game, then you're generally not too concerned with losing a generator or 2 or maybe even 3 in the early game. Hell, I have games all the time where I lose 2 or 3 generators before I even get my first down that I still manage to turn around and turn into a 4K. Again, because you can flip the switch and snowball pressure at any point in the mid to late game if you're playing well. Losing generators early does not mean that the game is over. However, I have noticed that being a very, very common theme that I keep seeing. People talk about how it's impossible to stop generators from popping early and how they lose a generator or two before they can even do anything about it. But the thing is that is okay. It is 100% okay for you to lose a generator or two before you even get it down as a killer, and you can still absolutely pull through and win the match. It is not over because of that. That is the killer's weakest time period. That is when they're their absolute weakest, and you could absolutely snowball map pressure and win the game at any point through good play. And I'm not even taking into consideration the perk Corrupt Intervention as well, which if you don't know is a perk that blocks the 3 furthest generators from you for the first 2 minutes of the match. So this perk essentially just is there to prevent the generators from popping before you can do anything about it. So you could even slap on this perk and even prevent that early game gen from getting done if you'd like. However, the obvious trade-off here is that you lose a perk for the mid to late game, which might help you get into that snowball situation where you win the game all at once. Okay, so moving on from the whole pacing topic, let's talk about something else, and that is expectations as far as getting kills as a killer. It seems to me lately that a lot of people are judging themselves, basically considering games to be losses if they don't kill all 4 survivors. I think this is like a huge fundamental flaw in people's thinking about the game that really makes their opinion on the balance of the game kind of skewed. If you're playing killer against 4 survivors that play extremely well, and you manage to kill 2 out of 4 of them, even if the 2 kills happen at the very end of the game, if you manage to kill 2 out of 4 of them, that is very good. That is a very good result. You got essentially a draw with a team that is very, very good. Unfortunately, though, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen a situation like this happen where the killer player then chalks it up as a loss and says that they didn't do well and that the survivors completely rolled them, when in reality, that is a very good game. I would even go as far as to make the argument that in a game like this where it's a 4v1 where there's a team of 4 survivors that have to work together, if the game was balanced in a way where the killer would 4K every single time regardless of how well the survivors played, would that even be good balance? What would even be the point of playing the 4 if even if you played perfectly it doesn't matter because the killer kills you every time? To me, I feel like if both sides play perfectly, if the survivors somehow play 100% perfect as a team, and the killer somehow plays 100% perfect as a killer, the ideal result should be around a 2 kill. And with that ideology in mind, it means that getting a 2 kill means that you performed well. You went into a game that was balanced, where the other team was good, and you also played well enough to, make it a good close match. On top of that, there's also nothing wrong with just having a rough match every once in a while. Even the very best players in any game ever will sometimes have bad games where they don't perform well, and they sometimes will lose games that they could have won just because they didn't play very good. To me, I think that a lot of these things that I'm saying in this video might sound kind of obvious from an outside perspective, but I think it's really hard to get a good grasp for this in Dead by Daylight just because this game can be so incredibly frustrating at times. As a killer, when you're going against survivors where it feels like you're playing well and you just can't stop the gens from getting done, and then you barely manage to squeeze out a kill or 2 at the very end of the game, it doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel like you won or that you played well, but at the same time, that is a good match. You did play well. If the survivors are playing hyper efficient and they're playing very, very well, that's how the game is most likely going to go. They're most likely going to get all the gens done, and you're most likely not going to be able to stop that. And being able to get a kill or 2 is still very, very good. However, I do think that the frustration of playing the game and having a lot of the frustrating things that happen in game definitely does affect people's perspective on things. And I think that's where a lot of these mindsets come from. Even with all that in mind, though, let's go back to the original question of, are gen speeds an issue? So there's 2 major things that increasing gen speeds would affect, and that is, first off, the balance of the game, and then second off, the overall just fun of playing the game. I think making a change like this would literally hurt both. As far as the fun factor, I feel like this probably speaks for itself. As a survivor, some of the most boring gameplay is when you're just doing generators. You're just sitting there holding M1. Sure, you get skill checks every once in a while, but it's not very exciting gameplay. So making you do that for even longer doesn't really sound like it's making the game very much more fun. That's pretty obvious though, but I think in terms of balance, I think the game is actually fairly balanced right now. The most recent kill rates that behavior has released, although this was a little while ago, but I don't really think the game has gone through any overwhelming changes. If anything, the game may have gotten better changes for killers with map changes and stuff that have happened. So I don't think these kill rates are going to be that far off, although they are kind of old. But you can see that every single killer hovers around in between 2 to really closer to 3 kills per game. And that's across all ranks. And at red ranks, where the games are supposed to be even harder, the killers are actually higher in kill rates, and they're way more average around 3 kills. And again, this is something I touched base on earlier videos, but I think I could just discuss it again. I think a big reason that this all happens, the reason why the kill rates are so high, however, killer players are still getting frustrated all the time, is because I think it's very frustrating to play against a really good team. Even if most of your games you're winning, the one off game you get where you go against really good survivors that make you feel totally helpless as a killer, it takes its toll on your psyche. And those are the games that you remember much more than the games where you perform well. But you have to keep in mind that they exist, because if you're trying to call for changes like higher generator times, then all those games where you do already perform well, the survivors that are already getting beat are going to have even less of a chance, and the gameplay is going to be absolutely miserable for them. And keep in mind, again, that these are most games. This is how most games go. You can see by the kill rates that most games, the killers perform well. So you can't really balance around the very minor percent games where the survivors are extremely good, even though I think in those games, a lot of the times, killers really are too hard on themselves for how they perform. You shouldn't be expected to be able to 4-kill in those games, and it definitely shouldn't be balanced around that either, because then all the rest of the games would be absolutely miserable. I think overall the idea of making gens take longer is just bad on all fronts. I don't think it'll help the balance, and it'll definitely make the game a lot more boring as well. Although I do definitely see the point of view where killers definitely could use some help against higher tier survivors, but I don't think that should come in the form of longer generators. It's very proven based on the games where you can apply pressure as a killer that the gen speeds are fine. Assuming that you can apply pressure to the survivors in a decent way, you're usually able to get kills, and most games go pretty well. So if there is a glaring issue here where killers are struggling against the top tier survivors, I don't think the solution should be just making the survivors take longer to do generators. I think changes need to be made so that killer players can get pressure easier. I actually made an entire video on this where I talk about maps, because I think the biggest issue with this is maps, and it's between like their size as well as how strong the pallets are on the map. I'll make sure to leave a link for that video below in the description, as well as leaving a card for it if you guys want to check it out. But essentially, the problem isn't that the gens get done too quick. The problem is that it's way too hard to put pressure on survivors that are really good, because they know to either hold W across very large maps, or they know to play every single pallet super safely and not take any risks, and you can't really get a hit on them until they run out. This, again, being applied to most killers anyway. This obviously doesn't count if you're like a spirit or a nurse, but for most killers. I also just want to take a second and say that these games that are like quote-unquote unwinnable, where the survivors are really good and play perfectly efficiently and even a good killer can't stop them, are extremely rare. These are extremely, extremely rare. The fact that they exist, I think, makes killers use them as an excuse for playing badly a lot of the time. I see so many times where killers have a bad game and they just, instead of looking at themselves and trying to find the flaws in their gameplay and trying to improve, they instead just blame the survivors for being a survivor with friends and for being sweaty, and claim that nothing they could have done would have helped them win. When in reality, I play against teams like this all the time that like quote-unquote sweat and try to gen rush or whatever, and they're very often beatable through just good gameplay and good strategy, and I think the games that are unwinnable are a lot more rare than people realize. However, they still do exist, and it is still a problem, so I think it should probably be looked at. However, I don't think that you should let these games skew your perspective towards the overall balance of the game. I think the overall balance of the game is still good, and I think the idea of telling the devs to add more time to generators is completely absurd in the current state of Dead by Daylight. Focus on getting yourself better at the game. Don't worry about losing generators, especially in the early game. And if you manage to kill at least 2 survivors, even if you don't even get the kills until the very end of the game after the gens are done, you still played well and that was still a good match. Keep all that in mind and focus on improving, and you'll realize that the game is actually in a pretty good spot, balance and objective-wise. Now, if you wanted to make an argument about whether it's harder to be a good killer as opposed to a good survivor, that is definitely an argument that could be made as like a newer player that's trying to get good at killer and saying that it's like easier to be a good survivor. That is definitely an argument that could be made, and that is a whole nother video if I want to talk about that. So if you guys are interested in a topic like that, let me know. I would love to talk about it. I think it's an interesting thing that I can make a whole nother video on, but I think I'm going to keep going in circles if I keep going for this video, so I'm going to stop there. And just say thank you guys so much for watching and listening. If you guys have anything that you want to add to this discussion, please let me know in the comments below. I know I always say this, but please actually give this video a like, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to be disliking this video because they disagree with me about this. And thank you guys so much for watching. Sub to the channel as well if you guys haven't already. And thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys have a good rest of your night. I'm out of here. See ya. Take care. See ya. I'm out of here. See ya. I'll see you later. See ya.